really reiterate on revolves around the economic growth, which the National Treasury is suggesting that it is going to grow by around 6%. Yet, the money which is sent to county governments, Mr. Speaker, remains at the 370 billion. So you ask yourself, why is this economy growing, yet there's no money being sent to counties? Mr. Speaker, the other big silent issue, which should be a concern to every Kenyan, not only the members of parliament, both in the Senate and the National Assembly, deals with the issue of borrowing locally. The budget policy statement, Mr. Speaker, proposes that the National Treasury or the government will borrow locally about 4% of the Kenyan GDP, borrowing locally. As a businessman, Mr. Speaker, the first question that comes to mind is, what will happen to the money which is normally available for local businesses to be able to borrow locally? If government is borrowing 4% of its GDP locally, doesn't that mean that all SMEs will just close shop and go home? Mr. Speaker, that is very disturbing. And that ought to change. Because if we are to borrow, we should always consider borrowing outside the country, because borrowing locally, every financial institution will feel more secure to lend the money to the national government rather than lend money to a small businessman in Narok who wants to be able to improve his wheat farming activities. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that unless we remain true to the Constitution, for us to defend our counties, we will end up just being reduced to really voting machines, a conveyor belt, and we will not play any role in terms of developing the economy of this nation. Mr. Speaker, in the budget policy statement, the issues which are raised, additionally, the Treasury was supposed to release about 38 billion to county governments. Yet we know very well that we had a court ruling that made it very clear that conditional grants should be sent differently to the counties. It was very clever for them initially to come up and say, we are going to give counties 370 billion, and this came out after the long fight over 11 votes to ensure that our counties do not lose money. But when we caught that action, we then ended up having to develop a legislation that will support conditional grants on how they can be sent to counties. Mr. Speaker, the National Assembly came up with a different framework on how that money should be sent to counties. Until today, Mr. Speaker, the conditional grants, which are mostly supposed to help our health functions, which are devolved, have never been dispersed back to the counties. The issue of the equalization fund is still another issue. That money is has not still benefited the people who were supposed to benefit. So if we come here and we don't pay attention to the text in the budget policy statement, what difference will we have with the Kenyan citizens who are out there who expect us to be able to criticize, to go through what is presented to us to protect their interests? Mr. Speaker, I am concerned, and I would wish to request my colleagues to take some time and actually read this budget policy statement before voting for it. We are talking about post-COVID period. I don't even know whether we should call it post-COVID because we are still going through the COVID. Omicron is still there. Mr. Speaker, in developed nations and any other country around the world, after a recession, because I don't know what else you'll consider this but a recession, government spends money, inject money into the economy so that you can be able to revive the economy. Now in this case, you are saying, no, the same amount of money, 370 billion, is what we are going to keep, yet you are telling us that the economy has grown. You're also telling us that, no, from today, I will borrow 4% of the GDP locally. What are you telling us? On the same case, Mr. Speaker, if you look at this being, and I'm going to read this. It's saying, going forward, the National Treasury is optimistic that the economy will turn around over the medium term with a projection growth of 6% in 2021, supported by the continued reopening of the service sector, recovery in manufacturing, and strong global demand. And then, which is very, very important, is that this BPS is prepared since the introduction of the Big Four agenda, and the universal healthcare is one of the Big Four agendas for the government. How will you ensure that we attain that universal healthcare, yet you're not increasing money that is supposed to go to the county governments? How will you ensure that we obtain that universal healthcare, yet you come up with a system that tends to claw back devolved functions from the devolved government to the national government? Mr. Speaker, in this budget policy statement, we are told that there will be about 50 healthcare facilities which are going to be built. We are not told how these 50, who will build these 50 healthcare facilities. Is it the national government? And what business will the national government be doing, carrying out a function which is a devolved function? Mr. Speaker, we saw the president going at night, opening clinics in Nairobi. How are they built? Who paid for them? Is it the county governments? Was that money allocated by Parliament for them to be able to do that? We need to stop this business of being a conveyor belt, and we'll look at critically the issues which are brought here, because we'll be judged harshly by history. Mr. Speaker, this budget policy statement to me is utopian and completely unattainable. We need to change. We cannot allow Treasury to borrow locally. And if we pass this budget policy statement the way it is today, then we will be killing SMEs. We will be telling them, you go to other countries and go borrow money, because you cannot be given any money locally. We looked at this. I am a member of the Health Committee and a very active member. And some of the recommendations that we raised, Mr. Speaker, we raise them so that they can be able to ensure that we protect the devolved functions. Schedule 4 of the Constitution is quite clear on what is devolved, and health is devolved. We always talk about the principle of form follows functions, yet we don't go by it. When we devolve function, we follow them with the money. Some of the big key recommendations that we came up with, which I want to reiterate, and I hope that my colleagues will look at them, is that government should look into borrowing externally, not locally. We are not going to stop you from borrowing because we have no control of what you do. I wish we did. I would have believed that we did. But because nowadays Parliament is just a conveyor belt, then we want to ensure that we can be able to stop you from doing it. We tell you, do not borrow locally, borrow externally, so that we can be able to save our economies here. Number 2, Mr. Speaker, the National Treasury and the Ministry of Health should develop a framework to allow for pending bills to be cleared as a first charge of account. Mr. Speaker, that is a principle in accounting, and I'm sure the majority whip will tell you that. If you have pending bill, it should form the first charge on your accounts. Our pending bills, Mr. Speaker, have grown tremendously, I think to a figure of about 120 billion. How are we going to ensure that we clear this? We are killing businesses. When we come up with a budget, let us not just build the language, the English. Let us demystify what it really means for us to be able to have a budget that can be able to help our economies grow. The other thing which is very important, Mr. Speaker, is that the Ministry of Health and the county government should act to ensure that the framework is developed to provide for the 5,500 health workers who are employed on contract under the UHC program. Because this budget policy statement is silent on that. It doesn't tell us what will happen. You are telling us you want to achieve the universal health care. You want to ensure that eventually you will be able to provide health care to every citizen in this country. But you are not telling us how you are going to protect the 5,500 workers who were employed on contract. Mr. Speaker, we've seen what has happened this year with anything to do with health. If you look at KEMSA as an example, the workers there who were on contract, their contract term expired, they were not renewed, and then after that, sometimes, even though the law is presumptive, in the sense that if a contract is not renewed, you become permanent and pensionable, those people are sent home. What country are we living in, Mr. Speaker? It is about time that we ask ourselves these tough questions. We talked about the issue of concurrence of bills, Mr. Speaker. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that there is a Huduma bill which is in the National Assembly. And I'm not sure whether it is the National Assembly sought concurrence. Because the Court of Appeal overruled even the decision of the former Supreme Court. Now, the National Assembly can just come up with legislation, pass them, go to the President for assent. The Huduma Bill, which, Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow it to just go to the President to be assented to when it is literally rendering the immigration services really another just department. You know, we need to be pragmatic. You need to be progressive. But with such kind of budget policy statement that looks at just really clawing back on devolution, there's no progressive there. What we are doing is that we are telling our Kenyans that, listen, you don't know nothing. What we are going to do is that we are going to just carry out any functions we want. The national government is the alpha and the omega, yet we talk about devolution. That is something that ought to come to an end, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's also special funds which should be allocated to the establishment of cancer centers in Meru and Kakamega as proposed in the BPS. We need to look at the entire country and say, even though we cannot get equality, there's some form of equity that can be able to help us. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I will not be supporting this budget policy statement because of the reasons that I've given, and I want to summarize those reasons. One, I cannot support a budget policy statement that seeks to kill SMEs. That is proposing borrowing 4% of the Kenyan GDP locally. Go borrow elsewhere. That is one, Mr. Speaker. Number two, this issue of concurrence of bills, Mr. Speaker, is very, very important. Because during the budget making process, which is where we are beginning now, and I hope that, and I want to borrow the words of my colleague Wetangula, that all 47 elected senators, including the ones who are not elected, who form part of the delegations, should actually be here to go through this budget-making process, should pay attention to what is brought to this House so that we can be able to save our people. I want to ensure that the people of Narok, Mr. Speaker, get the services they need in healthcare, the hospitals which are built there, but I also want the county government of Narok to play a role, not just to be a bystander. Today, there's a lot of money that has not been sent to county governments, and we are sitting here happy, coming in to pass a budget policy statement, yet we cannot ask questions. What will happen with the money, the conditional grants that have not been sent to the counties? This fight between the National Assembly and the Senate should come to an end, Mr. Speaker. When we came up with a bill on conditional grants, and the National Assembly comes up with a framework, what does that tell us? Two elephants are fighting, who will suffer the grass? So the people in the counties who are supposed to be benefiting from the conditional grants will not benefit from them unless we end this thing. And now we are going into the next financial year, yet services which are supposed to be rendered in the last financial year have not been rendered, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is why on an annual basis, the National Assembly will come up with a supplementary budget on every given time. I think we have come of age, Mr. Speaker, as a nation, with very intelligent and educated leaders. We can be able to develop budgets that do not require supplementary at every given time to fit interest. Number three, Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate on this issue of concurrence. I'm glad that at least as a Senate, we have an opportunity to go through this budget policy statement. But in terms of concurrence of bills, I always support judiciary. But in this case, the decision which was rendered by the Court of Appeal, really overruling even the decision of the previous Supreme Court in terms of concurrence, will kill this parliament. I'm aware, and I want to reiterate that there is a Huduma bill. And that Huduma bill is very dangerous, Mr. Speaker. It is extremely dangerous. Because what will happen is that it will convert all immigration officers into NIMs. How dare you say that a passport is a primary document? It is not a primary document. We know that what is a primary document is a national ID and the birth certificate. But now when you come in and you add a passport, then it means that although it's a primary document, it is okay for it to keep on changing numbers. Mr. Speaker, sir, I know in your time of traveling, and you've traveled all over the world, you probably exhausted about 3 or 4 passports. You have not maintained the same number. I think we need to go to a time when we can be able to really look at everything. And the reason why I'm raising that issue of the Duma bill, Mr. Speaker, is because it will affect the budget. It will be part of this budget. And there's a lot of money there. So with all this money, which the National Treasury is saying we are going to raise, you are going to raise a lot of money, pay debts, but kill counties. I'm here to defend devolution, and this is why I will not be supporting this budget policy statement, because I cannot support a policy that kills small businesses. We want to be progressive. We do not want a situation whereby everything in this country is all about the Benjamins, it's all about a few people, the bourgeoisies. What about the small people that we talk about? The only time we'll be able to attain universal health care is if we are open enough, ensure that when we are building hospitals, it is not controlled by the Ministry of Health here. That function is devolved back to the county governments. Allow the county governments to be able to build those hospitals, fund them. I want the Chair of Finance to go and tell Treasury to find a framework to release the conditional grants which they are holding, even if Parliament has been unable to come up with a bill. Because in the decision of the court, it said, come up with a process of how you send that money. Let us follow the law. The law was designed to be able to help us remain in the course. No one is above the law in this country. With those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I reject it completely.
Thank you. Senator Faria.
Speaker, for giving me this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I beg to support the budget policy statement. Mr. Speaker, but I have a couple of concerns and some recommendations as well. Mr. Speaker, in terms of revenue targets, we have, in this House, we've dealt with 5 budgets. And Mr. Speaker, in all the 5 budget cycles, we have never met the revenue targets, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question is, why do we always get it wrong, Mr. Speaker? Because if, you know, when you, where I worked before and I've done a lot of budgets, Mr. Speaker, the history informs the future of budgets. And of course, you stretch yourself a little bit so that you're not lazy in terms of achieving your targets. But at the same time, you should not always get it wrong. And when you're also budgeting for the same revenue, you should have some conservatives that takes care of the excesses that you always project. That is never my. The problem I have with having excessive budget projection is that, you know, revenues are matched with expenditure. And therefore, when you have a very highly over projected revenue, it means you'll also have a very highly over projected expenditure. And Mr. Speaker, that also is part of the reason why probably part of the debt comes about. So Mr. Speaker, as we budget, we need to be sensitive about that. Mr. Speaker, from this statement, I see that agriculture and source of diaspora funds have continued funding our economy. Mr. Speaker, when you realize that some of the sectors are the ones that increase your output and increase the revenue that is generated by this country and increases the GDP of this country, then I think we need more investment in those sectors. And as you will see, I will continue to explain, that some of the sectors got less money this time, while there has been a decrease. In terms of, like if you check, Mr. Speaker, the proposed ceiling for agriculture, rural and urban development sectors have decreased by 15.6%, Mr. Speaker. My only hope is that decrease from the national government has gone to counties. If it hasn't gone to counties, what that means is that the sector that generates more revenue gets less allocation in terms of the budget, then we are likely to generate less, and we are likely to not meet our target for revenue generation. And we need to be very, very careful on how we handle that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, of course, as you realize, we are living in a very, very hard times because of the COVID-related problems. Our revenues are likely to be, with Omicron and all these other problems that are upcoming, I hope we will not lock down this economy. Because from what I have seen, we have locked the whole world for for almost 18 months, but still diseases keep on increasing from a country to another country. It is high time we evaluated, and I also urge Kenyans to take more vaccines, because that will also enable us to have a more healthier nation that is more productive, that supports the growth of this economy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the county allocation as by the PPS, as per the PPS, proportional increase to the revenue in terms of the allocation of revenue to the counties has decreased from 22% in the financial year 2017-2018 to 17% in the financial year 2022-2023, despite the fact that due to the handshake agreement, when the revenue stalemate came, there was an increase of 50 billion to the kitty of the counties. Still, we are underperforming by a whole 5%. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that is not acceptable, and we should, the revenue, if we were able to generate more money, counties should get more money, Mr. Speaker. Then the other issue is around, Mr. Speaker, pending bills, which has increased to 102.69 billion, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I always speak about pending bills because pending bills have very significant impact on how our economy grows, in how the businesses grow, and in how the GDP of this country grows. Mr. Speaker, if you owe counties owe more money to people, if national governments owe money to people, their ability not only to invest is impacted, but also they cannot finance their debt. And Mr. Speaker, that will result in many small business or mid-term, the smaller and the medium-sized businesses to fall. Mr. Speaker, the more we have businesses falling, the more we have unemployment, the more we will have revenue shortfall, the more we will have investors not interested in this country in terms of investment, and the more we will become uncompetitive compared to people in the other, our counterpart in this region. Mr. Speaker, and then the other issue is around the PPS proposing that the county should be given 370 billion. Mr. Speaker, if you do not factor in inflation, what that means is the money that the counties are disposed to spend will be less than what they had last year by the percentage of inflation. So, Mr. Speaker, this House should not accept the same amount, not now, not in the future, because inflation, always affect our ability to spend. So I am glad that I am also a member of the Finance Committee. I am happy that we are proposing 35% of the revenue of the last audited account, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other issue I wanted to comment about is the commitment fees that we always have. My question is, in terms of money borrowed but not utilized, if you have no target for that money, why borrow? Because borrowing is costly, And if the the amount of the percentage, not only do you have two things. Number one, the commitment fee charge, and then